if if the question does show up in the chat, then to the presenters, please just read the question before you answer it. And from there, we'll get going. So Jake, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
All right, perfect. So hi, everyone. My name's Jake Perryman, and I did my capstone on NDVI analysis of phosphorus stress corn. So a little bit about myself. I work at Penn State University, and oddly enough, I think I'm one of the only students that actually does work here. I work for the Animal Resource Program as an ABSL3 and Notobiotic Laboratory Animal Technologist. So I know that's a mouthful to say, but basically I manage animal experiments with animals that are infected with potentially harmful strains of virus, such as certain types of influenza. So overall, I manage animal research and I ensure the health and welfare of animals. I perform various medical procedures. I make sure labs have everything they need to conduct their experiments. And every once in a while, I do a little bit of training. So before I get into previous research or what I've actually done with my project, I need everyone to understand what NDVI is. So it stands for the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And basically, it's just a measure of how healthy vegetation is. It's popular in the world of agriculture and forestry, and it is created by performing band arithmetic on two bands. So the red and the NIR bands are manipulated. You look down here right below NIR, you can see the formula. It is NIR minus red over NIR plus red. And executing this formula yields a range of values that go from -1 to 1, where extremely negative values closer to -1 are associated with water and clouds. The negative values near 0 are impervious surfaces such as roads and pavement. Values near 0 on the positive end are soil, and then everything else is vegetation, with larger values closer to 1 being healthier vegetation compared to the lower values. So if you look here on the right, you can see an example of what a colorized NDVI raster is. It has right here in the legend here, you can see that there are low values of 0.3 ranging all the way up to values of 0.6. And what this says here, a farmer can look at this and go, oh, my field here, and with the areas in the red, this is where I have to focus because everything else with those yellow and green hues is doing much better. So this ultimately saves him time and money. And last, before I get into my previous research, it's important to understand why NDVI is so popular in the world of agriculture. So it falls into a broader concept called precision agriculture. And the general idea here is to save the farmer precious resources, time, and money. So to better understand the importance, I think it's important to discuss the applications. And that's what this previous research that I'll be talking about will address. So I'll be talking about irrigation management, crop phenology, and crop yield estimation. So the first one I'll talk about is irrigation management and assessing agricultural drought. So Sruthi et al. In 2015 assessed drought through NDVI analysis, and he was concerned with the impact of crop and health productivity. So his goal here was to basically develop an early warning system free of charge for farmers in his area. And he did this by using NDVI and also bolstering this index with land surface temperature data through Landsat. So what he got here on the right, you can see is one of the time points that he collected. And you can see in the south and southeast corner is dark green vegetation, which is the vegetation is robust and resilient and doing very well for its environment. And the areas around it with lighter hues of green are areas that the farmers actually would have to spend more and more time on. So it's a very robust tool that he developed and was actually able to save a lot of time and money for the farmers that he was taking care of. Next is another fascinating way you can use NDVI, and that's to assess crop phenology. Venancio et al. In 2020 used this tool to map the phenological stages of corn, and he operated under two assumptions. The first was that each stage of corn has a unique NDVI signature, and as these stages of corn progress from one to the next, these NDVI values, they predictably change. So in his findings, he found that Through analyzing a time series NDVI, he found that that low NDVI values were associated in the beginning of the plant life, followed by a rapid increase in value during the growing stage. And then lastly, getting closer to time of harvest, there's a decrease. So a lot of you might be asking, well, why is this important? So depending on the time of the year and the stage of the plant, you can optimize the fertilizer application and irrigation management. So for example, during time of harvest, you wouldn't need near as much irrigation or fertilizer because there's no need. And then lastly, and this is my favorite by far, you can use NDVI to estimate wheat yield or estimate biomass. Benedetti did this with wheat. He used NDVI and created a time series of data. And with that data, he compared it to previous years of NDVI time series, along with that historical yield. And with that, he was able to compute a mathematical model that basically operated under the assumption that the health during the growing season is a direct indicator of the yield. So basically, in terms of NDVI, the higher the NDVI value is, the more yield you're going to get. And if you look here at the table on the right, the only two columns I want you to focus on are the NDVI, which is the predicted values, and the ISTAT, which is the actual yield values of that year. And you can see for most years just how close NDVI and the NDVI estimate was to predicting the actual yield for that year. So it perfectly demonstrates how robust this index is. And then lastly, I think it's important to really discuss the limitations of NDVI. So Huang et al. In 2021 conducted a commentary review and basically said that there are three areas that need to be taken into consideration before actually using this index. And they are atmospheric effects, sensor factors, and soil saturation. So he said basically not taking this into consideration can create erroneous results and therefore skew the results of the study. He then went on to say at the end that this tool is very powerful, but it is even more effective when integrated or bolstered with other data. So the research that I talked about, the way it was integrated with land surface temperature data and yield data. So it's a list of endless possibilities that you can use this tool with. So with that being said, I can finally get into my project. I'm collaborating with the SARS lab at Penn State University to assess the effects of phosphorus stress on inbred species of corn. So specifically, we are focusing on two strains of corn, which are popular in the world of research. They are B73 and Ohio 43. Ohio 43, notably the difference here that we're looking at is that this plant demonstrates a higher resilience in adverse conditions to whether they be biotic or abiotic stressors. So the goal of this experiment is to basically determine what genomic part of Ohio 43 is responsible for this resilience by putting random genomic insertions of Ohio 43 into B73. So once this is completed, these plants, these inbred species, will be subjected to phosphorus stress across 4 fields, which were all planted on May 2nd of this year. They are 2 high phosphorus and 2 low phosphorus. And to assess the robustness of each genotype or a species, it will be subjected to tissue analysis, root analysis, soil composition testing, and biomass yield. So basically, my objective is to demonstrate the spectral differences between each genotype using NDVI. And to do that, I used the DJI Mavic 3 multispectral. This drone has a 20 megapixel RGB camera, and then it maps 4 wavelengths, and each wavelength is mapped with a 5 megapixel camera. It maps the green, red edge, and NIR wavelength. So if you look here on the right, here's a picture of the drone that I used. And the picture doesn't do it any justice, but it's a very small drone. Here's my proposed data, but before I get into that, it's important to understand how highly specific this analysis is. So it will be performed at the row level, and there are 48 genotypes per field, all the same per field. Each genotype has 5 replicates, so 5 rows of corn per field, and that comes out to a total of 960 total rows across 4 fields. So because of this, I needed high resolution imagery, and it is collected at 3 different time points. Mid-June, which was collected on June 19th, end of July, which I actually just collected yesterday, and end of September or beginning October, depending on the time or depending on the status of the plants and whether or not they're ready. Lastly, I need soil composition data. So these soil samples, which were collected at the same relative time points, were sent to Penn State's Agricultural Analytical Lab. This is a very busy time of the year for them because they're getting swamped with samples from not only Penn State, but everywhere else in the county. Look here on the right, here's my study area. There are 2 low phosphorus and 2 high phosphorus, as I've already said. Each field is about 600 square meters, and that totals out to 2,400 square meters. This is located in Rock Spring, Pennsylvania, and it's about a 20-minute drive from Penn State University. Here's my methodology. I defined the study area and planned the mission. Once everything was good to go there and approved by the PI of the lab, I collected the multispectral imagery and processed the imagery in Pix4D Mapper. Also in Pix4D, I generated the surface reflectance map, as well as calculated the NDVI raster, which was then exported as a GeoTIFF. From there, I created a polygon feature class of that raster in ArcGIS Pro for each individual row of corn. And then once everything was in place, I ran the zonal statistics as table tool. Once this was done, I exported all of these tables into an Excel file and then combined everything with the genotype spreadsheet that was produced by the lab that contained all the relevant materials about where each genotype was located in the field. From there, I joined the updated spreadsheet to a polygon feature class where I was able to interpret the results. And all of these steps are going to be repeated for each time point with the exception of defining the study area and creating the feature classes, which the feature classes are going to be reused just for consistency purposes. Here are my results for the first time point. The ground sample distance was 2 centimeters. And I got NDVI values ranging from negative 0.19 to 0.88. What's important to see here is that the low, I know I don't have them labeled here, but the low phosphorus fields, the bottom right and the top left, they are much lower in pixel value and health compared to the high phosphorus fields, which are top right and bottom left. I wanted to further quantify everything and illustrate it by creating box plots for all average replicates of low phosphorus and all of high phosphorus. And what's important to see here is the difference between minimum and maximum values. You can see that the maximum value for low phosphorus is below the maximum or the minimum value for high phosphorus. And to better illustrate that, I created a heat map of every field. So you can see here that the low phosphorus fields, low 1 and low 2, they are predominantly yellow and orange, which is the lowest 2 classes of the heat map. And then if you look here at the high phosphorus fields, you can see that it's basically orange and up. There is some yellow, and that's from lack of germination, but the difference is extraordinary. So I summarized the genotypes next. And the first table that I created was a top 10 list of genotypes per field of all average replicates. And you can see here, again, just how different in value the low phosphorus and high phosphorus fields are. And the takeaway here is that there's a number of genotypes that were found in low and high that were only found in 2 fields, and even less that were found in 3, but there wasn't a single genotype that was found in all 4 fields. So I took it a step further and averaged all replicates according to the phosphorus concentration. So I was able to tell a much better story and found that there were 4 in common between low and high that thrived in low and high. So that was NIL 1008, 1005, 1059A, and 1044 by ACR. So in conclusion, NDVI by itself is a very powerful tool for vegetation health analysis. I did find specific genotypes that demonstrated resilience to low phosphorus and thrived in high phosphorus that will better able the lab to determine what part of the genomic sequence of a high 43 is responsible for that robustness. There are more time points that are going to be necessary to better understand these genotypes and map everything out. The second time point was collected yesterday, but I didn't have time to do anything. Kids took up pretty much all of my day. And then lastly, soil data is going to be necessary. We just got the soil data as well, and I couldn't do any meaningful analysis with it other than look at it and confirm that the fields were truly low and high phosphorus. So with that being said, here are my references. And I'd like to acknowledge the Sawyers lab. Top right here is Rory Sawyers, the PI of the lab. He's not one for pictures, so his lab forcibly put him in there and photoshopped his head in. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Great job, Jake. Does anybody have any questions? You can either unmute or type into the chat. I'll go first in case anybody's typing. Jake, you had mentioned that corn, there's different stages of corn have unique NDVIs, and it sounds like the same is maybe true for wheat. If someone were to do this on other crops or vegetation, is that usually the case that it's different for each stage, or is that fairly to corn? And
it's pretty consistent through the board. Now, those NDVI values may be higher, may be lower, depending on the crop. I don't know that much about it, but it's like I said, it's pretty consistent. Yes.
Excellent. Any questions from anybody? And I guess other than just having more time to actually have gotten all of your data and everything, what would you have liked to have been able to do differently? And I don't know, is there anything like that you thought to add?
So I think my biggest flaw here is that I get tunnel vision very bad, and I get an idea in my head, and that is what I stick to. So I would have created the polygon feature classes a little bit differently. I drew every single one, and I'm coming to find out there are a lot better ways to do it. But like I said, I had that in my head, and that's what I went through with.
Well, that's a good learning experience, I guess. And now when you do it the other way, you'll be able to attest to the fact that it's good to make a grid or whatever. But
of course,
good exercise to do. Okay, well, great job. Maybe you could put your email address in the chat window in case anybody might want to follow up with a question.
I actually have one real quick.
Oh, perfect.
For the Mavic 3, did you use the solar sensor or calibrated reflectance panel to calculate the reflectance values?
No, I did not. Not for the first time point. So we rented the drone through Blue Sky's drone rental out of Washington, and all they sent us was the drone. And honestly, I was so new to it that I had no idea what a reflectance panel was until well, I used a DJI Inspire with a Mica Sense yesterday for my second time point, and they had a calibration panel. So from the second time point on, I'll have that.
Okay, that's good. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, and Samantha, I think you're next. So when Jake, if you want to stop sharing, and Samantha, you can go ahead and start sharing.
Perfect.
Thank you. Perfect. You can go ahead and start whenever you're ready, Samantha. We don't hear you yet, so if you're
I'd say, can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Okay. I've been having IT problem after IT problem today.
Well, good now.
All right. Hello, all. I'm Samantha. Thank you for sitting in on my presentation. I'm from Michigan, and I currently work as a production planner for Archway Marketing Services. So I plan the assembly lines for our Detroit facilities, which is pretty different from what I'm about to talk to you about. Today, I'm going to go over developing a species distribution model of wild lupin for Conner blue habitat restoration. I've had a personal interest in the Conner since an internship with the U.S. Forest Service provided me with the opportunity to help with population counts. And ever since then, I've been really eager to apply GIS and further explore that species. Conners are a federally endangered species and listed as threatened in Michigan. They rely on natural disturbances that clear the canopy for lupin to grow, the most common disturbance being fire. And their decline has been heavily attributed to habitat loss. They're short-lived. Lifespans only range from a few days to a few weeks. They have 2 breeding cycles each summer, once in June and another in August. The emerging adults in June lay eggs that are dormant until August, and then the August adults will lay eggs that remain dormant through winter until the following June. And these eggs will lay dormant on the leaves of wild lupin. And lupin is also the only source of food for the Karner caterpillar. Lupin is a flowering perennial. It's native to North America and has been introduced to Europe. It grows best in dry soil, and its preferred habitat is best described as open savanna or oak barrens. It's heavily affected by canopy cover, requiring partial shade, but also enough access to the sun to compete with other vegetation. And the degree of canopy coverage relies on natural disturbance, as previously mentioned, specifically fire, to keep their access to the sun available. Knowing what we know about the relationship between the Karner and lupin, Karner habitat restoration relies on the restoration of lupin. And habitat restoration can accelerate species recovery with methods such as mitigation, remediation, revegetation, and habitat enhancement. And applying these methods to disturbance-dependent species such as rare butterflies like the Karner has been successful in the past. By removing trees to thin the canopy and building like artificial dams, populations of the St. Francis satyr increased each year at these restoration sites. And then selective logging was done to thin out the canopy and reintroduce the baton blue butterfly, and populations would go on to double at these sites. Due to the relationship the Karner has with lupin, the successful habitat restoration of the Karner relies on where lupin is and its potential over time. So to narrow down potential sites for habitat restoration, we need to establish a species distribution model of wild lupin in the state of Michigan. Species distribution models, or SDMs for short, are used for multiple reasons, including habitat restoration, species management, land management, and they're also used to view the effects of climate change on a species over time. SDMs use occurrence data and environmental variables to develop the potential range of species can exist in. So to break this down a little bit more, occurrence data can be observed presence or absence, depending on the method used to create the species distribution model. And to clarify, the environmental variables should be abiotic factors used to consider what limits a species. And the result is a prediction based on where a species is known to occur in relationship to the variables that influence where a species can occur. And as previously mentioned, SDMs can be used for habitat restoration. You can also use future projections to create a prediction of future species distribution. There have been some previous studies done on the Karner and lupin. The previous distribution models of Karner subspecies that were generated didn't use future data sets, so they don't provide much insight into future projections and not much insight into lupin distribution. And the lupin distribution that's been established was done using a raster calculator site selection. So it's pretty static in nature and only captures the data like at that time that the data was recorded. So my goal was to create a series of SDMs using future data sets to predict changes in lupin distribution over time. And my hope is that the information can be applied to resource allocation and guide habitat restoration efforts of the Karner blue. Moving on to methodology, this is a general roadmap of what I'm going to walk you through, starting with maximum entropy. Of the different models and methods used to create an SDM, I used maximum entropy. Maximum entropy is a measure of uncertainty. So to utilize maximum entropy is to utilize the highest level of uncertainty. In doing so, prevents any assumptions about the data. And this approach works on a cell-by-cell basis to determine the probable distribution of maximum entropy and statistically relates limiting abiotic factors to a species, resulting in the probability of distribution, also known as a species distribution model. MaxEnt was developed by Stephen Phillips in 2006 with museum specimen collections in mind. Museum specimen are often tagged with locations where the organisms were collected. And seeing that some of these collections are vast and span many years, Phillips developed MaxEnt to create historical species maps using presence-only data. So this is a presence-only model, doesn't require known absence locations. So to run this analysis, I used the presence-only prediction maxent tool in ArcGIS Pro. Located in the spatial statistics toolbox, this tool is designed based on maxent principles, and it requires a point file of species occurrence, explanatory environmental variables that can be in the form of rasters or vector fields, and a defined study area. And to the right is a visualization of how the tool works, with observation points depicted top left, explanatory variables bottom left, and then the resulting SDM to the right. The study area pictured left was used, courtesy of the state of Michigan, and to the right is a summary of the data and their sources for the environmental variables. The occurrence data was obtained from the Citizen Science-Based Global Biodiversity Information Facility. The bioclimatic variables from past and future were obtained from WorldClim. And when selecting data from WorldClim, you have to choose between 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. SSPs are just different scenarios society can take when handling climate change. And I chose SSP 245 because it's described as the middle of the road, so as not to assume any extremes. And you also have to select from different general circulation models, or GCMs, which is the climate model used to generate the predicted bioclimatic variables. I chose to use the most recent model from the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology out of Germany. And this is because it fell in the suggested sensitivity range of 2.5 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, coming in at a sensitivity of 3 degrees Celsius. And the only other option in this range did not contain complete data, so I kind of got there by default. And the remaining environmental variables, elevation, soil, tree canopy cover, those were provided by USGS, NASA, and the UN. This is a generalized overview of the tool. There's lots of steps. Running the tool initiates a series, as you can see, all these steps. And the first is spatial thinning is applied to the species observed data points. Spatial thinning is the use of a defined nearest neighbor distance to dictate how close 2 data points can be, reducing the number of data points within the defined distance specified by the user. And the purpose of this is to limit sampling bias or duplicate observations, which is a common problem when you're using open citizen science data. And next, background points are generated if indicated to do so. Sometimes data already has background points, so it's not always necessary. But these background points are used to capture data at unreported and unknown locations to compare to the observed data at known presence locations. The tool then extracts values, from the explanatory variable data sets, and these extracted values are used as X to plot against Y being the probability of presence. And then mathematical transformations can be applied to these XY pairings, including linear, pairwise, squared, and hinge. The tool will then minimize coefficients using regression analysis to identify and remove statistically insignificant variables from the model. And validating itself, the tool resamples points randomly. And finally, the probability of presence is predicted. Jumping the gun. The generated results consist of what's called the output predictor raster. This is the SDM depicting the probability of presence. In addition to this, the resulting rasters and charts generated during intermediary steps, those are also generated if indicated to do so. And this includes the training rasters, the resampling of the model, the various XY pairings and their transformations, and it also provides diagnostics. This is an overview of my resulting SDMs from each time period. I did 5, as you can see. 1970 to 2000 was the historic data that I obtained. And then the future data sets, 2021 to 2040, 2041 to 2060, 2061 to 2080, and 2081 to 2100. I felt seeing the progress could be insightful for future studies and expanding on why these are changing and when. and getting to change. The far right image is a change in probability from the historic 1970 to 2000 data set to the 2081-2100 data set. And notable areas to look at are around Grand Rapids and Detroit. And I didn't anticipate much probability in these areas due to the fact that they're a little more developed in suburban. However, I didn't account for the fact that developed areas have a more open tree canopy. Which brings me to this percent tree canopy coverage. The left is the canopy coverage data used, and the right is the canopy coverage plotted against Y for the years 2081 to 2100. This was generated by the intermediary steps of the tool. When looking at this, there's a 99.9% probability of presence when canopy coverage is between 16.24 and 72.4%. And the dark green on this data set is 75%. So it really emphasizes this relationship right here. And while the scope of this was to answer more of where and not so much the why, more extensive studies would need to be done for that. I wanted to emphasize this particular variable because, as mentioned in the beginning, lupin is so reliant on canopy coverage. This is the result of the model validation. This was generated by running the model 10 times for each time period and seeing like how many times it accurately identified known presence points. On average, they were correctly identified as 77.67% and incorrectly as 22.32%. So definitely some room for improvement there. A little bit before we get into the questions. In the future, I'd like to expand the study area. I'd also like to dive deeper into variable interactions. I'd like to explore different GCMs and SSPs, but for right now, we do have a prediction of where lupin is, and we can go from there and hopefully use that for restoration of the Karner blue. So, do you have any questions?
Nice job, Samantha. If anybody has questions, please type them in the chat. I was just wondering, Samantha, how will you distribute what you've learned? Like, is this just for, who will you be sharing this with, and how might this get more widely shared?
I haven't thought too far into that, but I do still have contacts at the Forest Service. So
Okay.
this is something I could reach out to my old mentor. She's still stationed there.
Yeah, it would be nice for this to get some light, even though you don't have to do that or present it somewhere. It would be good to share your results. Any other questions? It's interesting that we have a couple similar projects in the class with a couple drone and vegetation and a couple pollinator projects. So it's nice that they complement each other. Okay, well, Samantha, if you could put your email in the chat, you might get some follow-up questions. And Josh, if you want to go ahead, Samantha, if you can stop sharing, and Josh, you can go up next.
Righty. Screen sharing. Let's see if this works. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Berndorf. I'm currently a student at Penn State, like many of you. And my primary background is in archaeology and anthropology, very specifically historic period archaeology. So GIS usage in archaeology is pretty much ubiquitous. It's how I got introduced to GIS. It's how many of my friends have gotten introduced to GIS. And it's been increasingly utilized since its introduction into the discipline in the 1980s. Archaeology, and this is likely because archaeology data, almost all of it has a spatial component, where things are. Artifacts, archaeological features, sites, everything has a spatial component. And uses of archaeological GIS include the management of spatial and aspatial data, cultural resource map production for cultural resource survey reports, and predicting the likelihood of cultural resource materials. Archaeologists are very frequently given these large swaths of land that they need to survey, and it's not efficient. They don't have the resources to cover hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. So these predictive models can be used to kind of determine where these materials might be. But the question remains, how much has GIS been integrated within broader archaeological theory? Is it just being used as a method, or is it being integrated in archaeological thought? So this led me to this journal by Ulla, Klo, and Melling, and where they not only examined how archaeology has grown, or how GIS has grown within the archaeological discipline, but they analyzed how it's been being utilized. So they look at not only how much it's being used, but is it being used for applications purposes? Is it being integrated theoretically? What's going on here? And they found that most archaeological publications in mainstream journals have been basically applications focused, and they're relatively basic at that. And there's not really any indication that GIS and geographic methods are really permeating archaeological thought and practice. So what's preventing this broader theoretical integration? Ulla et al. Identifies 5 specific roadblocks to broader archaeological GIS integration. These include the nature of archaeological education, how archaeologists are being taught GIS, the availability of resources, etc., over-reliance on commercial software, namely Esri, and the barriers to entry that price can cause, technological barriers to adoption, gaps in acceptance or use of GIS. Some people are kind of stuck in their ways and don't want to change their methods. And then perceptions of GIS is merely a tool and not something that really needs to be integrated with broader archaeological theory. Tackling all 5 of these is both a tall order and just beyond the scope of this project. So we're going to focus on this one, the nature of archaeological education. So Ulla, Klo, and Melling further point out that there are limited paths for archaeologists to learn GIS. Frequently in cultural resource management jobs, the person handling GIS is either an archaeologist who's been trained from a geography department or geospatial program, or somebody with geospatial training that might not have archaeology training. Both of these result in an archaeologist who is not trained in archaeology-specific geographic methods. They also note multiple paths forward. They suggest that archaeology and anthropology programs integrate more geospatial exercises in their courses, offer archaeology-specific upper-level GIS courses, and in general, a renewed focus on archaeological GIS pedagogy, be it publication or dissemination of resources and methods, just archaeologists focusing on how they're teaching GIS and sharing that with other archaeologists. So in that line, this project has a couple primary goals. I want, and I have looked into the state of archaeological GIS pedagogy. I did this by analyzing and comparing GIS instruction both inside and outside the archaeological discipline. In doing so, I wanted to look at what core concepts are really taught at the entry level and identify a couple different pedagogical techniques, again, both inside and outside of the archaeological discipline. Just because archaeology pedagogical resources are really few and far between. There's not a whole lot out there. Some of my broader goals for this project include this is meant to serve as a resource for archaeologists, right? It's meant to lower the barrier to entry and give them a starting off point to see how other people are integrating archaeological GIS pedagogy in their various courses, to see which methods or which techniques or which subject matter might best apply to them. You've noticed a lot of my fellow students in this have had past research sections. This entire project is basically a giant past research section, right? It's looking into different published methods of how archaeologists utilize GIS, how they've taught GIS, and how other people have utilized and taught GIS. And I utilize 3 broader research categories. Again, it's archaeological GIS applications, how archaeologists are using GIS in their publications, archaeological GIS pedagogy, again, though very limited, how archaeologists are imparting these GIS lessons onto their students, and external perspectives of both, going into mostly geography and GIS departments. And part of this methodology, aside from a giant literature search, was interviewing some professional experts. These include Dr. Scott Ingram. He's a professor of anthropology and archaeology at Colorado College. Marcy Reiser, who is an archaeologist for the Rio Grande National Forest for the U.S. Forest Service, and Ella Axelrod, who is a PhD candidate in a geography and forensic archaeology program at the University of Nebraska. So I basically asked them three primary questions. I asked them questions regarding their geospatial education, how they've engaged in pedagogy and how they've kind of taught people, and recommended skills they'd suggest for people entering archaeology at the entry level. I'm not going to go too far into this for the sake of time. I will do a little bit of a summary though. Dr. Ingram took one graduate level archaeological GIS course in which he wasn't taught really how to use the software, but mostly focused on theoretical approaches. Reiser has a graduate certificate from a natural resources department, but this wasn't archaeology focused. She did end up applying this research or this instruction to her graduate level research. And Axelrod received their archaeological training in undergrad and then later in an archaeology department, and then later took an advanced archaeological GIS course in graduate school. Dr. Ingram has partnered with the college's GIS lab to teach GIS, whereas Reiser and Axelrod primarily focus on one-on-one training sessions with contemporaries and training employees. And in terms of recommended skills, they were pretty straightforward across the board. Almost all of them recommended basic data management skills, the ability to produce a site map, the ability to perform basic spatial analysis such as buffering, clipping, using basic geoprocessing tools, etc. So again, we're focusing here on what should be taught and how it should be taught. But we need to keep in mind, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I'm not suggesting that there's some new fancy way that we should be teaching GIS to archaeologists, nor am I suggesting that there's a right way to do it. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, I'm hoping to demonstrate some examples, compare some different examples, both inside and outside archaeology, and see if we can draw some commonalities and give people a jumping-off point. So one of the common things in looking at archaeological methods and how they utilize GIS is an attempt to categorize it into sections. Connolly and Lake, for example, described 5 essential archaeological GIS tasks, including the acquisition of spatial data management, database management, spatial data analysis, and spatial data visualization. In the context of historical archaeology, Gonzalez-Tennant describes 3 separate categories of historical archaeological use in GIS. Inventory and geospatial database management, geospatial analysis, and map making and data visualization. Likewise, Ebert describes almost identical categories with visualization, management, and analysis. Now, Ebert describes these as a hierarchy with visualization at the lowest level of complexity and analysis at the highest level of complexity. However, anybody in this room who's made a map and has actually put effort into making a map can tell you that visualization is not uncomplex. So what you can see here is I've attempted to consolidate these into one kind of comprehensive list of 3 geospatial skill categories that pretty closely mirror those by Gonzalez and Tennant and Ebert. They are geospatial visualization, geospatial data management, and geospatial analysis. So going more into what to teach based on these categories, let's start with visualization. And let's go through a few examples. Beatty and Moreau, in their instructional module for the French National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research, have an entire session on semiology of graphics and cartographic data visualization, with the ultimate goal of having everybody in the field project able to produce maps for a final report. Mischewitz et al. Doesn't mention it in much detail, but briefly mentions an introduction to cartography. And after this brief introduction, students being able to produce a variety of maps from a variety of data sets. And then finally, though not specifically focused around GIS, Yobera calls for an entirely new division of archaeology called archaeological information science, which is primarily focused around creating really dynamic visualizations and using new ways of visualization to analyze data and present results. And again, while they don't specifically mention cartography or GIS in general, geographic data definitely falls within this category of geographic visualization. Finally, going into geospatial data management, this was probably the most pervasive thing mentioned by all of the people we interviewed. Merchant and Preisler in their semester-long GIS course, archaeological GIS course, teach students strategies such as geographic file creation, attribute table management, such as like adding and deleting fields, data selections, etc. Gonzalez-Tennant states that data management is essential to the practice of cultural resource management, and that cultural resource management firms utilize GIS for a variety of inventory management. Statewide databases in this sector have been essential for protecting archaeological sites from natural disasters, site looting, and development projects. He also states that archaeologists have pretty vehemently neglected to develop any standards and guidelines to this, which leads to a lot of data being unusable or unintegratable just because there's no standards across the board. And finally, to bridge this method with analysis, Gupta describes a complete lack of documentation of any sort of operations these data have gone under, basically recording these in the metadata. And basically states that archaeologists have constructed a bunch of black boxes for themselves. It's very common in archaeological projects that you will utilize data collected from a previous project. And it's common also that you have no idea what sort of operations, transformations, or cleaning that data underwent. So in order to better understand the data we're using, Gupta argues that we should be instructing people in better data management and data documentation methods. And then finally, what to teach. Geospatial analysis, this is the geospatial analysis section. And the most pervasive three, although there are many that can be utilized in archaeology that I encountered, were viewshed analysis, predictive modeling, and cost services. Viewshed analysis, as we all might be aware, allows us to create visualizations from specific locations, seeing which areas are visible from those locations and which ones are not. These are also described as visibility analysis. This was in Merchant and Preisler's course, what they described as the most utilized method in archaeology students' final projects. Predictive modeling, on the other hand, as we described earlier, is super useful for cultural resource management. When you're given huge swaths of land, it can use environmental data and existing site data to determine likely locations for cultural resources. And it's largely dependent on the idea that humans and human populations and movement are intrinsically linked with environmental factors. And finally, we've got cost services or least cost path analysis, which allows archaeologists to use things like elevation surfaces and slope rasters to determine potential movements in and out of archaeological sites to identify most likely travel corridors. But again, this is a really brief overview, but the resources depicting this stuff are few and far between. So it becomes necessary to look externally into the geography and GIS fields to see what everyone else is teaching. And that brings me to two models that we're all probably familiar with. I think they talk about it in Geography 482 or 483, the Geographic Information Systems and Technology Body of Knowledge, and the Geospatial Technology Competency Model. The GIS and TBOK breaks up the entire field of GIS. It's super comprehensive into 10 specific knowledge areas: analytics and modeling, computing platforms, cartography and visualization, domain applications, data capture, data management, foundational concepts, GIS and teen society, knowledge economy, and programming and development. Likewise, the GTCM is pretty comprehensive, but it's more focused around the labor market, so analyzing what market needs are for geospatial employees. And it covers a broader range of things, including workplace competencies and industry-wide technical competencies, as well as all the way up at the top, management competencies. I'm not going to go into too much details, but just know that the GIS&T has over 1,600 learning objectives, so it's super comprehensive, and almost all of these competency tiers in the GTCM have a bunch of building blocks underlying them. But how do these apply to the archaeology categories we described earlier? Well, we can clearly see some through lines between the two. Geospatial visualization very closely aligns with cartography and visualization in the GIS and TBOK. Geospatial data management aligns with data capture and data management, and geospatial analysis aligns with analytics and modeling. Regarding the GTCM, basically all of them are encompassed within the industry-wide technical competencies tier, which focuses primarily around GIS skills and GIS abilities. However, if you're talking about archaeology-specific applications, these models have you covered too, with domain applications in the GIS and TBOK, and the occupation-specific knowledge areas, occupation-specific technical competencies, and occupation-specific requirements in the GTCM. So looking more into how archaeology is taught, again, these resources are even harder to find, but I was able to find a few examples. Agby Davies, for example, in her semester-long course, promotes a concepts first method of archaeology. Basically, she wants students to be exposed to the archaeological methods and examples of how these things are applied before they even touch the digital tools. This happens through a series of lectures, a series of exercises, and a series of discussions. They believe that using digital tools should happen after you've had a very thorough background in how they're applied. Mishewitz, in their multiple semester long courses, introduces students to GIS theory and how to use the software first. That way they have a solid foundation for how to use the software when they get into more theoretical uses of it. They describe 3 primary class types: theoretical, which are primarily focused around discussions and lectures; computer-based practicals, which again have these lectures and discussions, but have students working with the actual software; and field-based practicals, which have students working in the field and utilizing field techniques. Beatty and Moreau are teaching under completely different circumstances. Again, for their research with the French National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research, they're teaching their stuff in 3 to 5 days modules. These things take place at the scale of operation, meaning these are happening while a project is going on. Instruction is taking place simultaneously. And there are a bunch of different training methods, including trainings that take place in a classical way, where students follow along with instructors, and they follow along in some cases with written tutorials. And finally, Hispanja, while they don't discuss how to teach archaeology, they discuss a couple of ways that you can manage how well you can identify how well your students are learning geospatial techniques and spatial thinking. These include prior knowledge surveys, in which you kind of gauge how much experience students have with this technology prior. Self-confidence surveys, in which students can record how confident they are in their abilities to perform certain tasks, and professors can in turn design special techniques to kind of bring students up to par. And then finally, 1-minute papers, in which students can describe after a lecture or activity what they believe the key takeaways are, and instructors can use those to analyze what they think is getting missed or what's not being emphasized enough. Once again, with this paucity of resources, it's necessary to look externally, again, to the disciplines of geographic information systems and geography. One of the most commonly utilized techniques and pedagogical techniques utilized that we've all utilized actually on quite a number of occasions are guided practicals, or canned exercises, where students walk through a series of step-by-step instructions and are given a set of data sets. And they follow just a bunch of linear steps to get to a solution. And there are a bunch of pros and cons to this method. This allows students to work at their own pace, which is great in the context of Penn State, because a lot of us have jobs, everything's asynchronous, but it's also great in a classroom because it accounts for people with different technological abilities. Some people are just not as tech savvy as others, and it just takes them longer to figure out the software. So it allows people to work at their own pace without feeling rushed or feeling like they need to follow along. Students arrive at the same easily accessible solutions. Instead of managing multiple different projects and having to analyze the results, professors can very quickly and easily access whether a student has arrived at the correct solution or not. And then finally, it's really good for establishing some of that buttonology or basic software skills. Some of the cons are that success can depend on computer literacy. Again, that's a pretty common problem with archaeological GIS, is some people aren't the most tech savvy, so it requires them to catch up a little bit. Students can sometimes uncritically follow steps, simply going through the motions and clicking the buttons while not understanding what they're doing. And finally, students are at risk of developing a GIS cookbook, or coming across the idea that GIS is a set of linear steps, when in reality, there's a lot more to it, a lot of troubleshooting, and a lot of theory underlying it. The other method utilized was a project-based approach. In this method, groups of students were paired with a graduate student team lead. In addition to lectures and quizzes and tests and all of those other traditional teaching techniques, these students in these student groups collaborated on a project that was typically for the graduate students' research, and it had a number of benefits. Team leads gained new leadership experience because they had to coordinate all the efforts of the undergraduate students, and they gained a new perspective on interpersonal experience. Students gained additional instructional resources, not just the instructor, now they've got their team lead, and they stayed and emulated real-world experiences. So what do we take away from this, right? I just threw a lot of information at everybody and a lot of different methods and ways people are teaching GIS in archaeology and outside of archaeology. Mainly, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to archaeological GIS pedagogy. There are a number of different ways to teach it, and it's all situational. It's all dependent on the technology you have available, course size, course dynamics, how much time you have available, etc. The methods described above are widely applicable, and this project as a whole is trying to by identifying these methods, encourage more archaeologists to incorporate geospatial instruction into their existing curricula. And in providing these resources, it's hoping to lower the barrier to entry. That being said, here are my references that I utilized throughout this project. And if anybody has any questions, shoot them now.
Great job, Josh. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute or type in the chat. Josh, I was wondering if while you were doing this, archaeology was like a great example of this, because like it totally makes sense to me. There are so many GIS users who are archaeologists. Can you think of any other professions that could be, you know, someone else in a different profession could take what you've done and apply it? I'm thinking like landscape architecture, for example. I can picture a couple other disciplines that might benefit from seeing what you've done.
Yeah, so in my experience, because I did teach GIS and archaeology for a few years, and I did work in a central GIS lab for a college. A lot of disciplines are actually pretty far ahead of archaeology in their GIS utilization. I will say there were, again, it's going to be institution specific, right? I don't think there's any discipline in particular, but I think this is designed for any discipline or any individual professor who's not super familiar with GIS, but sees its utility and wants to bring it into their instruction. I know where there were some environmental science instructors or biology instructors at Colorado College that utilized GIS for their very, very specific purposes, and didn't bring it kind of more broadly into their theoretical approaches or apply it in any other ways. So this resources is really just meant to kind of encourage them and to show them, hey, there are resources out there. Here are some of them. Here are some really widely used ones. This is a jumping off point. Get into it, and hopefully you'll find some way to apply it to what you're doing.
Great. And then you and I had discussed, it's sort of similar to what I asked Samantha about, you know, how will this reach other people apart from the folks that you were consulting with? Have you and I talked about maybe sharing this with like the Esri education team, or this could be potentially something that could be accessible from their training site, or have you
so that was an idea I had, and that actually aligns pretty closely to, again, that article that introduced me to all this, Ulla, Klo, and Milling. They actually call for like a generalized publication venue in the Society for American Archaeology. And they're pushing for people to like start publishing their educational resources there. If something like that were to come about, which I'm still hoping it does, they just proposed that in 2023. I think that would be a great venue for this. Otherwise, I would be really happy to talk to one of those individuals or both of those individuals I spoke with who are currently in professional archaeology, Scott Ingram or Marcy Reiser, to see if they have any ideas for venues. I thought about the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists, but that's more towards, again, professional archaeology, not really academics, but they also have connections in the field. And then, of course, I would consider doing this with the Esri education team. But yeah, that's all kind of up in the air right now.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, not that's of course not the end all be all, and the archaeological resources that you mentioned would be more important, and that's where those folks would discover that. But if somebody were to, I feel like we do have some students who are like, oh, I'm an archaeologist, I just heard about this GIS thing. And so maybe having it in multiple locations, like an introductory GIS site, like that GIS training site or something with a resource like this, sounds also valuable.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
Great. Okay, any other questions from anybody? If not, we will call it a day. We will have 5 presentations on Monday, so I hope you guys can come to those. Those start around 5 o'clock, I believe, Eastern, 5 p.m. So I'll see you there. Have a good weekend, everybody, and thanks so much for all the presentations. Great job.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
See ya.